Hi, it's Chris with Implied Music, and today I'd like to talk about alternative ways to split the octave. Of course, major and minor scales, pentatonic scales, we're very used to using them, but people have been creating scales for millennia, and there's lots of ways to do it. There are some problems with how we talk about it and how we teach it. We'll try to get into some of that. We'll just take a little survey. Well, let's get to it. Well, when I learned about scales in school, the whole list of scales, I was taught to call scales that weren't major, minor, maybe the pentatonic scale, exotic scales. And I think that there's a problem with that word now because it implies a kind of a distance, detachment, and even, I think, maybe a legacy of superiority, certainly of a certain amount of colonialism because of the Western European sort of school of musical theory education. Um, that sense of otherness sets it apart, and I'd like to get away from that in my own work. And I'm also going to say this. This is the second piece that we need to get into as we talk about how to split the scale. There are actual physical realities, the physics of sound, to the way waveforms interact. And those physical realities create strong grounding points in the audio spectrum. An octave is an exact multiplication by 2 of the frequency of any pitch. The fifth is another whole number ratio. And in fact, the entire harmonic series has whole number ratios to a fundamental, which when folded down can create a kind of a scale that isn't like the one that we use today, the equal tempered scale, but rather a Pythagorean. We'll just call it a Pythagorean scale. And that's just based on the mathematics of the scale. Some people call the scale we use today equal tempered because it gives us decent sounding fifths wherever we play them. Well, it's a compromise. And the music of the world, music from Africa, Asia, the North, indigenous peoples' music, very often uses restricted scales around single tonal centers, and those scales frequently use Pythagorean relationships or even more specific and sort of culturally determined relationships that we just can't approximate on a keyboard. And for that reason, the use of exotic scales, put that in quotes, in the West, especially from composers in the 19th century, I'm thinking of something like Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade or perhaps Ravel's Bolero, where the sense of the music itself feels like from another world in a way, or at least another culture. It's been a compromise. Well, that compromise is hard to balance. I think we shouldn't avoid using alternative scales. Can I use the word alternative scales? I've been chit-chatting a lot. Let's dive in and take a look. Okay, so we're looking now here at the covers of a couple of books, which I recommend wholeheartedly. Nicholas Slonimsky was a theoretician of the early 20th century, and his Thesaurus of Scales and Melodic Patterns is invaluable, especially for composers, Western composers. He also wrote a terrific and funny book, A Compendium of Musical Invective, which collects all the scathing reviews that newspapers and magazines of the time gave to the great classical composers. Well, Slonimsky's a basic text, and it's one that I was exposed to early. When I was in school, Yusef Latif hadn't written his repository of scales and melodic patterns yet. He was a graduate student with my professor, Dr. Roland Wiggins, at the same time that I was in school. He was at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And I saw him a lot. He's a terrific theoretician, a great musician, and this book is fundamental as well. These two books are going to get you a long way in understanding how to use these things in the context of our playing and our composing. If you search online, you'll find examples of scales, and they're frequently labeled thus. And as you can see, they are labeled in terms of geographic location. And I guess we could say that makes sense in a way, but I'm not such a big fan of this labeling, but I don't know what to call it, but the sounds are great. There's a whole class of scales which use the flat 9 that we call the Neapolitan scales. Here, this scale here, that's what they call here the Oriental mode, has a flat 9. You see it down there, C, D flat, we'd have to call it E, F, G flat, A, B flat, C, and a similar, the Egyptian mode, and then perhaps a similar, the Arabian mode, and then the Persian mode. Again, these are all similar. Well, I mean, it's a great sounding scale, don't you agree? The sounds of these triads and these scales are signature. And basically, I mean, if you think about it, what we're doing is our ear is comparing the experience of hearing this scale to the experience of hearing a much more conventional scale that we're accustomed to hearing every day, major, minor, pentatonic. We're sort of stuck comparing. And of course, comparing is a real big deal. We shouldn't really compare too much as artists. Go right for whatever feels true. But listen to these sounds. Now, these melas, which are sort of Hindustani or Carnatic scales, are not accurate on the Western keyboard because the tunings are just not, spot on. They're not what would be used in the culture. And yet they can be an awful lot of fun. For instance, Ramapriya has a dominant C in it, doesn't it? You see the C, E, G, B flat. It's a great sound over a dominant chord. Learn the scale. Oh my God, it's kind of like the altered scale, isn't it? Now, I'm not talking about modes of the major scale, modes of the minor scale. What we're looking at here are scales that we've used over the years to evoke, I'll just say Western composers have used to evoke a feeling of otherness. And that, as I said earlier, has in itself a certain danger. The danger is we appropriate something which is not, properly true. However, I do believe this. Sound is sound. It is in itself a thing. And so the sound of these scales should be somehow internalized by us. My teacher suggested the best way to learn these scales is to sing them, and I couldn't agree more. You don't have to sing well and no one has to hear, but just set your tonal center and what's it like to sing a half step up from there and then a third and then another half step and then a major third. You know what I'm saying? Get that in your ear and then try playing around with it. The exotic scales don't have to be exotic. You can own them and take them into your own compositions, take them into your own musical world. Well, I hope this has been useful. I feel like this has been a bit of a screed, kind of almost political. Well, music is political in a way. It's certainly social, certainly cultural. And I'm particularly interested in questions like this. I'd like to know what you think. So drop me a line. I don't want to start a whole firestorm, but I think generally speaking, as musicians and as artists, our open-mindedness is one of our strengths. Like and subscribe. Yeah. I'll see you next time.